Welcome to the tutorial how to import bitmap images. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to import a bitmap image as well as all the preferences associated with that procedure. So once again, although we ended the previous tutorial in the white drawing view, I switched to the camera view for this tutorial off camera. So there are several ways to import a bitmap image. One way is to go to the File menu at the top and select Import Images. And as you can see, the Import Images dialog box appears. Or you can click on this button here, the last icon at the end of the File menu toolbar. And as you can see, the same Import Images dialog box appears. So the first thing you would need to do is click on this button here to browse somewhere on your computer to find an image. Usually you'll see this blank. I had been importing images a little bit before the start of the tutorial, so this is already filled in. So let's browse for that image. And I'm going to select this one, Fit 1080 by 920, and select Open. So then under the Layer Properties heading, you can create a layer either named whatever you would like. So I could name it Fit without maybe the size, for example. Or I could create a layer based on my file name. And as you may have noticed, if you create single layer name, it automatically chooses your file name, but it also gives you the option to change your file name in this field. So I'm going to create a layer based on my file name. Right now, Add to Existing Layer is grayed out, and that's because none of my layers in the timeline are enabled. So I'm going to cancel this and enable my 3 layers. But lock my rough layer so you can see what happens when I do that. So this time, if I create symbol for imported items, and I'll tell you in a minute why that is, I can add to existing layer. And you can see that both the clean and the superhero appear, but not the rough, and that's because the rough is locked. Were it unlocked, you would see it now appear in this list because it is enabled in the timeline. The reason that I'm unable to add this image to an existing layer without it being a symbol is because right now I'm keeping it as an original bitmap. However, if I wanted to import it as a Toon Boom bitmap drawing, which means that it's a bitmap within a vector frame, as you can see, I do have the option of adding to existing layer, but I can only add to the clean layer because if you remember, our clean layer is a bitmap drawing layer and we used a bitmap brush to outline our superhero character on this layer. However, if I then convert to Toon Boom vector drawing, which basically means I'm vectorizing my drawing, I also have the option to add to existing layer, but this time I can only add to the superhero layer because if you remember, that's a vector layer and that's where I outline my superhero using pencil lines, so vector pencil lines. So in this case, I'm actually just going to create a new layer. I'm going to base it on the file name. I'm not going to put it in a symbol, and because I want to show you what happens using these 3 different options here, I'm going to start with the first one, Keep as Original Bitmap, and I'll tell you about the alignment and transparency in just a moment. So let's just do that first and say OK. And I'm just going to disable these 3 layers once again in the timeline. So the only thing I want you to get from this so far is to see that if you import an image and keep it as its original bitmap format, you are unable to use any of the drawing tools on this bitmap image. And you can see right away as I pass the select tool over the image that there's a white circle with a cross through it, meaning this cannot be used. So I'm clicking and nothing is happening to this image. You know, I can try to use any of the drawing tools and none of them work. The only thing that would work are tools from the animation toolbar, such as the transform tool. So using this, I could rotate my image, for example, and keyframes would be created for the movements that I'm making. In addition to all of this, notice here in the timeline that beside the file name or the layer name, that the symbol doesn't look like the symbol you see for all the other drawing layers. And that's because even though the clean is a bitmap drawing layer, it's actually like the second option in the import images dialog box. It's a bitmap but within a vector frame. So this symbol means it's really just a bitmap. There's no vector frame at all and it cannot be manipulated. And what that image icon is actually is of a little mountain scene with a little sun. So you can really see it looks like a photograph. It's a bitmap image. Okay, so let's import another image. I'm going to click on the Browse button again, And this time I'm going to select pan and say open. So I'm going to keep everything the same except that in the alignment section, instead of choosing fit, I'm going to choose pan and say OK. And if we zoom out here, we can see that clearly fit and pan import in very differently. So let's start with fit. What the software does when you select fit is scale the image so that the height of the image matches the height of the scene. And what happened when we imported in a pan is that it's preparing the image to be filmed as a pan. So if you don't know what a pan is, it's when you take a background, for example, and you either move the camera or you can move the background, and you do this. So in the case of a vertical pan like this, it could be someone, say, falling down a rabbit hole, and so the character would be staying in place, maybe moving its arms and legs. It looks like it's falling, but what would really be happening is that would be panning the background. So there's some vertical movement in the background, and of course that's most classically seen more often. You see a pan maybe going from left to right when there's, like, say, a car driving in the middle of the frame, and in order to make it look like it's driving forward or towards the right side, you would pull your background image towards the left, like that. So then if we import a third image, so PR being project resolution, we can open that. And from the alignment rules drop down menu, we can select project resolution and say OK. And so let me hide the pan now. And so with the project resolution, you can see that the native size of this image is being represented pixel for pixel in the camera view. And we know that because the size of this image, which is the same as the size of the fit and the pan, is 1080 by 1920. The size of our project scene is 1920 by 1080. So the exact dimensions, but with the height and the width reversed. So if we select this image and we rotate it to exactly 90 degrees, you'll see that it fits perfectly within the camera frame. So now let's take a look at the transparency settings. So let's import image one more time, and let's keep everything the same. Let's import as an original bitmap. Let's keep it the project resolution, but I'm going to import in the same image 4 times, once with the pre-multiplied with white, once with the pre-multiplied with black, once with straight, and once with clamp color to alpha. And I'm actually going to choose a different image. I'm going to choose these rocks that were created in Photoshop as a background image. Okay, so I'm just going to disable the project resolution image and let's reset the view here. So this image, just like the 3 that I previously imported, also have the same resolution of 1920 by 1080, except obviously this one is fit horizontally or in the landscape orientation. And you can see that because if I select project resolution, they fit perfectly and they're not blurry, they're at a good resolution. So the transparency settings are fairly subtle, the first one being pre-multiplied with white. So if we zoom in a little bit here, let's take a look at the edge of our image. We can see that there's sort of a glowing line around our image. And what that is that with all bitmap images, as we saw, they fade out at the edges. So the pixels around the edges of the image become slightly more transparent and more progressively transparent. So pre-multiplied with white takes the color of these pixels as well as their transparency and multiplies them with white. And don't get confused with white pigment versus white light. So for example, if I added a white pigment to a red pigment, say when you're painting, you would get a pale pink. That doesn't necessarily work the same way when you're multiplying white with a red colored pixel. So it's not as obvious as having a white border versus a black border. It's really just the pixels being multiplied with white. And if we add a color card to our scene, and by default that color card is white, and we turn on the render view, we might be able to see the difference more clearly. Let me zoom in a little bit more here. So you have to zoom in really close to be able to see, but you see this kind of rainbow-like colored line. That's what the pre-multiplied by white looks like. If we then turn off the pre-multiplied by white image and look at the pre-multiplied by black, we'll notice that sort of rainbow pixely line is gone. If we go back to the OpenGL view and maybe zoom out a bit, you can just see that the edges are colored differently, and that's because they were pre-multiplied with black this time. If we then take a look at the straight transparency option, you don't see the border of colored pixels. It looks very clean around the edges. And then the last one is clamp to color alpha. I don't actually see a huge difference here in this case, but I can show you really quickly what that means. I'm going to deselect that layer, and let's go on to the clean layer because that's a bitmap drawing layer. So we get our bitmap color palette. So let me create a new color. And I'm going to give that color the RGB values of 250, 180, and 30. Actually, let's go to the HSV view so you can see that it's like a yellow. And then if I decide to create a second swatch at half those values, so half of 250 is 125, half of 180 is 90, and half of 30 is 15, you'll see I kind of get like a golden brown color. But you can tell that it's within the same hue value. It's almost just like you took your color picker and slid it downwards like this to get those half values. And my point being that when you clamp color to alpha, if the transparency value of the pixels at the edge of your image is, say, 50%, then the RGB values will be multiplied by 50% to get the edge color. So you'll get half the values at that transparency point. And maybe that's a lot of extra technical information. What you really should do when you're importing images is just try importing the same image using the different transparency settings, and depending on your background, see which one blends the best. And also you should always test in the render view. Let's go back to our images here to really get a good idea of what the image looks like, because this is what it's going to look like in a render. So if, for example, this image was not 920 by 1080 as I know it is, it might appear more blurry in the render view, or it might appear blurry here in the OpenGL view, but that's just because the software is displaying a lower resolution version of the image so that you can work faster. So it's always better to test in the render view because the OpenGL view will not give you an accurate reading of what your image will look like once it's rendered. So I'm going to disable that color card, and we'll disable this layer as well. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other import options. This time I'm going to keep all my layer settings the same as I have been doing, but we're going to take a look at importing as a Toon Boom bitmap drawing. So I'm going to select this, and actually I'm going to browse for another image. I'm going to start with this one. It's TB horizontal fit. And that's because if you notice down here in the alignment rules, the three options that we have for the rules are horizontal fit, vertical, and actual size. So let's start with horizontal as a Toon Boom bitmap drawing and say OK. And let's zoom out a bit. Okay, so in the timeline here, we can see that our Toon Boom horizontal image has a different symbol. So we already know that it's a bitmap drawing layer and not just a bitmap layer because the icon is different. So it's actually the exact same as the clean layer here. It's a bitmap drawing in a vector frame, to put it very simply. But what this means in practical purposes is that you can actually use the drawing tools to manipulate this image to a degree. So for example, if I use the select tool, I can select the image, which I wasn't able to do before. It looks like I can rotate it. You see the icon come up. You can scale it, etc. You can also take the brush tool and paint on your image, so you can manipulate the image and work with the image, which is not something you were able to do if you left your image in its original bitmap form. So if we take a look at the actual horizontal fit, we'll notice that what the software did is it took the width of the image and matched it to the width of your project scene. So that's what horizontal fit would look like. If we then bring in the vertical fit, and I have to hide the horizontal for you to be able to see that, it looks like this. So it actually looks like just the fit for when you import in an original bitmap image. It matches the height of the image to the height of the project scene. And just to let you know, I selected an orange background color this time as opposed to black, to let you know this is the Toon Boom option in the import images dialog box. So when it says import as a Toon Boom bitmap drawing, it'll just give you a visual reference that the orange is relating to that choice. So let's bring in the last one, which is actual size here. We'll open that, we'll select actual size and click on OK. And once again, we see what looks like the project resolution alignment rule for when you bring in an original bitmap image. And once again, we know this because if we select the actual size, and this time notice I'm using the select tool and I'm not just using the transform tool, and I rotate it 90 degrees, you can see the same thing is happening. It's being mapped pixel for pixel into the dimensions of the project scene. And a better way to illustrate this example is if we bring in an image that's actually half the resolution. So this actual size image is 540 by 960, which is exactly half of 1080 by 1920. And so we see that it's half the size. And maybe it's better illustrated this way. You can see that it's exactly half the height and half the width. It's half the size. It's half the resolution. And it appears exactly like that in your project. Okay, so now let's take a look at the transparency settings for the Toon Boom bitmap drawing. So I'm going to browse again for that background rock image that we saw earlier. But this time I'm going to import it 3 times at actual size, once again with pre-multiplied white, black, and then straight. Okay, so let's deselect our orange actual size drawing and let's reset the view so we can see what's going on here. And if we zoom in really close again, we can start seeing those rainbow pixels around the edge. I have all 3 layers selected, so let's look at the first one, which is the pre-multiplied with white. Unlike with the original bitmap image, even in the OpenGL view, we can see clearly this line of pixels that have been pre-multiplied with white. If you remember, in the bitmap, images only displayed this level of colorful pixels when we viewed them in the render view. So if I enable the color card again and do that, we can see that the border of colorful pixels still exists, but they're a little bit softer. And once again, I'm zoomed in at 320%, so that's why we see those pixels that clearly. If we go back to the OpenGL mode, and we look at the rock background pre-multiplied with black, we'll see that there is a border of rainbow colored pixels as well, but you'll see that they're colored slightly differently. So obviously multiplying them with black versus white gives you a different color combination. And then just the straight looks like this, so a very cut off looking edge, but it still looks quite nice in the render view. And there is no clamp color to alpha option for the Toon Boom Bitmap image import. So I'm going to hide that and reset the view again and go to the OpenGL mode and click on the Import Images button one more time. So let's look at the last import option, and that's to convert to Toon Boom vector drawing as opposed to bitmap. And you may have already guessed that what this does is it vectorizes your drawing. So I'm going to select a drawing that makes a little bit more sense. I did a little bit of a cheat here. I actually exported the trace that we did of our superhero character, but not the vector trace that I did with pencil lines, but the bitmap trace on the clean layer. So we know for sure this is a bitmap. We also know it's a bitmap image because it's a JPEG. So let's click on Open. And I'll show you the two different vectorization options, black and white and gray. Let's start with black and white and click on OK. And as you may have noticed, there were no alignment rules, so it's always fit. So let's zoom out a bit and you can see that. And then let's zoom in. And you can see if we select these lines that they have a vector outline. So for example, on this vector layer, if I create a brush stroke and then I select it, you can see this brush stroke has a vector outline. Well, that's the same as what we see here. This once bitmap line now has a vector outline, which means it can be manipulated, it can be erased, it can be painted on. You can even fill it in with color like that because it is now vectorized on a vector layer. So then if we go back to our import image button and we select the same drawing, but this time we select gray under the vectorization parameters and click on OK. And then let's hide our vectorized drawing. You can see that it resembles more the original clean drawing that we drew in the software. It's a bit softer, there's a grayscale there, it's not a solid black line, but at the same time, because it is on a vector layer, you can do the same thing we did before. You can paint the zones, you can use the eraser to erase the line, you can manipulate it with any of the drawing tools, etc. So now that we know about all the different import options, what I'm going to do is import a bunch of background elements for our scene. So before I do that, I'm going to delete all of these layers that we do not need. By shift selecting them and then clicking on the delete button. I'm also going to get rid of our color card. So now we're exactly back to where we started at the beginning of the tutorial with the superhero layer, the clean layer, and the rough layer. So let's go back to our import images button. Let's browse. And what I want to do is do a multi-selection. So I'm going to select everything that we see here that begins with the word BG. So the city, moon, rocks underscore back, rocks, and sky. So I'm going to select the first one, hold down shift, and select the fifth one, and then click on the open button. And what I'm going to do is create layers based on file names. I'm going to import them as Toon Boom bitmap drawings. I'm going to keep them at actual size, and I'm going to keep the transparency as straight. So let's click OK. And let's reset our view so you can see what that looks like. And we might need to just shift a few things around here. So in my foreground, I want these rocks here. So I'll drag them above the city, the other set of rocks here, and I can enable and disable those so you can see what that looks like. So we have the sky background, the moon, the rocks in the background that are more transparent, so they blend into the background, which gives them that atmospheric perspective. So they look farther away because they look like they're blending into the sky color, the city, and the rocks. So because they're imported as Toon Boom bitmap drawings, we know that we can manipulate these drawings, but they keep that nice painterly quality about them. So that's it for the tutorial, how to import bitmap images. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, how to build a cutout character.